The first time Lily mentioned wanting to spend a weekend alone at our vacation cabin, I didn't think much of it. She claimed she needed some peace to work on her art, something about the mountains inspiring her creativity. And why wouldn't they? The cabin was our sanctuary, nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by the beauty of nature. But the trips became more frequent. Once a month turned into twice, and then every other weekend. It started to bother me, not just because of how much time she was away, but because of how excited she seemed every time she left. There was a bounce in her step as she packed her things, her smiles too wide, too bright. Yet when she returned, there was a strange quietness to her, like she was drained of energy. "Art is exhausting," she'd tell me with a small laugh, brushing off my questions. The cabin, though cozy, didn't seem like her ideal workspace. We built it together years ago, as a retreat for both of us. Rustic and simple, it didn't have the luxuries she usually craved. And besides, when had she ever been so invested in painting? She hadn't touched a brush since college. Something felt off. I tried to shake it, to tell myself I was imagining things. Maybe this was her way of coping with stress. Her job at the marketing firm had been especially demanding lately. But the little signs started piling up. A few months ago, I noticed she'd bought a new set of lingerie, far too expensive for her usual taste. When I teased her about it, she laughed it off, saying it was just to feel good about herself. She wore it when she went to the cabin but never here, at home. Then there was her phone, always locked and always within her sight. Lily had never been secretive before. We were the type of couple who'd hand over our phones without a second thought. Now, even leaving hers on the counter seemed to make her uneasy. Last weekend, as she headed out the door, something in me snapped. I'd been brushing off these feelings for too long, and I couldn't anymore. If she was hiding something, I needed to know. "I might drive up tomorrow," I said casually, as she zipped her bag shut. "Been ages since I spent time at the cabin." Her hands froze mid-zip. "Oh," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "You should probably stay here. I'll only be there for a night. No sense in us overlapping." She didn't look me in the eye when she spoke. And that's when I decided I'd follow her. The following morning, I set my plan into motion. Lily had left the house early, her car loaded with supplies for her art weekend. She kissed me on the cheek, her usual smile in place, but I caught the faintest flicker of hesitation in her eyes. That hesitation solidified my decision. Once she was gone, I packed a small bag, careful not to take anything that would raise suspicion if she noticed later. I waited an hour to give her a head start, then I started my drive to the cabin. The route was familiar, a winding stretch of road cutting through dense forests, each curve revealing glimpses of the mountains beyond. Usually, the drive brought me peace. This time, my stomach churned with unease. I kept picturing Lily's face from that morning, her hurried movements, and the way she clutched her phone as if it were a lifeline. Halfway there, I spotted her car. It was parked on the shoulder of a narrow dirt road that led into the woods. My heart raced. This wasn't the route to our cabin. What was she doing here? I slowed down, making sure not to draw attention, and parked a few hundred yards away, hidden behind a line of trees. As I stepped out of the car, I felt a rush of adrenaline. I didn't know what I was looking for, evidence, maybe, or an explanation, but I knew I had to find it. I followed the dirt path cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After walking for about 10 minutes, I saw them. Lily and a man I immediately recognized. It was Greg, a family friend. The same Greg who had shared countless barbecues at our house, who'd toasted to our anniversary last year, who'd helped me build the deck on the cabin when we first bought it. They stood close together, talking in hushed tones. Lily was smiling, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, and he leaned into her touch. I ducked behind a tree, my heart pounding in my chest. It was like watching a scene from someone else's life, something out of a soap opera. But it wasn't someone else's life, it was mine. My wife, my friend. The rational part of me told me to stay calm, to observe, to collect my thoughts. But the anger, the betrayal, it was all-consuming. Every memory of Greg flashed through my mind, every moment of trust, every shared laugh. How long had this been going on? Was this their first meeting or one of many? As I stood there, hidden in the shadows, I knew I couldn't confront them. Not yet. I needed more than anger. I needed the truth. I crouched behind the tree, my breath shallow, trying to keep my emotions in check. Every instinct screamed at me to storm over, demand answers, and confront them both. But what would that accomplish? A heated argument in the middle of the woods? No. I needed more. I needed proof. They lingered in the clearing for a while longer, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. I couldn't make out their words, but their body language spoke volumes. Lily leaned toward Greg, her hand resting lightly on his chest. He laughed at something she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The intimacy between them was undeniable. I slipped my phone out of my pocket and began recording, angling it carefully through the trees. My hands shook as I zoomed in, capturing every damning gesture, every touch. Part of me hated myself for stooping to this, for becoming a voyeur in my own marriage, but I couldn't let this slide without knowing the full extent of their betrayal. After a few minutes, Greg gestured toward the woods, and they began walking down another path. I waited until they were out of sight before creeping forward, staying low. The trail they took led deeper into the forest, away from the road. I followed at a safe distance, keeping them just within earshot. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and soon I saw the river, a secluded spot we'd stumbled upon years ago, during one of our first visits to the cabin. It had been our secret, a place where we'd laughed and talked about our dreams for the future. Now, it felt tainted. They stopped at the riverbank, and Lily turned to Greg, her voice low but firm. "We need to be careful," she said. "Jack's been asking questions." My stomach tightened. She knew I was suspicious. Greg placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said. "We've been careful. He has no idea." Her laugh was soft, almost bitter. "I just don't want him finding out like this. He doesn't deserve that." "Deserve what, Lily?" I thought bitterly. To be lied to? To be humiliated? They sat on a fallen log by the water, their conversation growing quieter. I crept closer, desperate to hear more, but my foot snagged on a branch, snapping it with a sharp crack. They both froze, their heads whipping toward the sound. I ducked behind a tree, my heart hammering in my chest. Had they seen me? Heard me? Greg stood, scanning the woods. "Probably just an animal," he said after a moment, his tone dismissive. Lily didn't look convinced. She glanced over her shoulder a few times, her brow furrowed, but eventually, they resumed their conversation. I stayed put, not daring to follow them any further. I had enough for now, enough to confirm my worst fears. The walk back to my car felt like a march through quicksand, every step weighed down by anger and disbelief. The drive back home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The cabin, our sacred retreat, was now the backdrop for my wife's betrayal. And Greg, a man I'd shared beers and laughter with, was a part of it. Every detail of the past few months replayed in my mind, Lily's sudden desire for alone time, Greg's frequent check-ins about our cabin renovations, and her distant behavior when she returned home. The signs were there all along, but I had brushed them off, blinded by trust. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across our quiet suburban street. I sat in the car for a while, staring at the house. From the outside, everything looked perfect, our neat lawn, the porch swing Lily had insisted on, the warm light spilling from the windows. But inside, it was all a lie. I didn't go in right away. Instead, I sat there, scrolling through the video I had recorded. My stomach churned as I replayed their interactions, the touches, the stolen glances. Each second felt like a knife twisting deeper. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. I needed a plan. That night I barely slept. Lily had texted me earlier, a casual, "Miss you," that felt like salt in an open wound. I didn't reply. Instead, I spent hours researching. I read articles on confronting infidelity, advice columns on navigating betrayal, even legal forums to understand my options. What stood out most was one consistent piece of advice: don't act on raw emotion. Plan. Protect yourself. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I needed time to think, to figure out my next move. I started with practicalities. First, I backed up the video and stored it securely in multiple places. Then I gathered financial records, making copies of everything: bank statements, property deeds, even Lily's credit card bills. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I wanted to be prepared. By mid-afternoon, I was ready to take the next step. I reached out to an old friend, Mike, who worked as a private investigator. We hadn't spoken in years, but I trusted him. He'd been through his own messy divorce and knew the ropes. "Jack," he said when I called, his voice warm despite my grim mood. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "Mike, I need your help," I said, my voice tight. "It's about Lily." There was a pause, then a quiet, "I'm listening." I explained everything: her solo trips, the video, Greg. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Jack, I'm sorry you're dealing with this," he said. "But you're doing the right thing by getting evidence and staying calm. I'll help you. Let's get the full picture before you decide what to do." He promised to start digging immediately, focusing on Lily's recent movements and financial activity. I felt a small measure of relief knowing someone else was in my corner, someone who could help me untangle this mess. That evening, as I sat on the couch with a beer in hand, I thought about Lily's return. What would she say? Would she act as though nothing had happened, smile and kiss me like she always did? The thought made my blood boil. I didn't know how long I could keep up the act, but for now, I had to. Sunday evening came with a heavy stillness, broken only by the sound of Lily's car pulling into the driveway. I stayed seated on the couch, the television on but muted, the flickering images a poor distraction from the storm inside me. My hands gripped the beer bottle so tightly I thought it might shatter. The front door opened, and Lily stepped in, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Hey you," she said warmly, setting her bag down by the door. "Miss me?" Her voice, so casual, so familiar, felt like a slap. How could she act this way after everything I'd seen? But I forced a smile, my heart pounding as I prepared to play my part. "Of course," I replied, standing to greet her. "How was the trip?" She walked over and kissed me, a quick peck on the lips that felt more like an obligation than affection. "Good. Productive," she said, heading toward the kitchen. "I think I made some real progress on that landscape I've been working on." I followed her, watching as she opened the fridge and grabbed a bottle of water. She moved with the ease of someone who believed they had nothing to hide. "What about you?" she asked. "How was your weekend?" I shrugged. "Quiet. Caught up on some work, watched a few games. Nothing exciting." Her smile was faint but polite. "Sorry I missed it. We should plan a weekend up there together soon." I nodded, though the thought of being at the cabin with her now made my stomach turn. "Yeah, maybe." As she unpacked her bag, I noticed her carefully placing a folded blouse in the laundry basket, avoiding eye contact. Was it guilt? Or was I just projecting my own turmoil onto her every move? Either way, I couldn't look at her without picturing her with Greg, their hands brushing, their laughter carried by the wind. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. We ate dinner together, takeout she picked up on her way home, and talked about mundane things: her work, my work, the neighbor's new fence. It was surreal, this normalcy in the face of betrayal. I found myself scrutinizing her every word, her every glance, looking for cracks in her facade. But she gave nothing away. That night, as we lay in bed, she rolled over and rested her head on my chest. It used to be a gesture of comfort, of connection. Now, it felt suffocating. "I love you," she murmured sleepily. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I love you too," I whispered, the words bitter on my tongue. When her breathing evened out, I slipped out of bed and into my office. I opened my laptop and checked my email, hoping for an update from Mike. Sure enough, there it was. Subject: Initial findings. From Mike. "Jack, I've started looking into Lily's recent activity. There are a few things you should know. Call me when you're ready to discuss." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. What had he found? Did it confirm what I already knew, or was there more? My hands hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. Not yet. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of it all pressed down on me, threatening to crush me. But I couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not yet. The next morning, I called Mike as soon as Lily left for work. She had kissed me on the cheek on her way out, humming to herself like she didn't have a care in the world. Watching her go was like watching a stranger. Mike picked up on the second ring. "Morning, Jack," he said, his tone measured. "You ready to hear what I've got?" "Just tell me," I said, pacing the kitchen. My nerves were raw, my chest tight. "All right," he began. "First, I've confirmed that Lily has been meeting Greg for a while now. They've been careful, different locations, staggered arrivals, but there's a pattern. Last month, they met twice in the city, once at a hotel bar, and another time at a cafe near his office." My hand tightened around the phone. Hearing it spoken aloud felt like a punch to the gut. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" "Hard to say exactly," Mike admitted. "But from what I've pieced together so far, at least 6 months. Maybe longer." 6 months. Half a year of lies and deception. I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. "Is there more?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I could take it. Mike hesitated. "There is. I checked her financial records like you asked. There's a lot of cash withdrawals, small amounts, spread out over time. But what caught my eye was a recent charge to a high-end jewelry store. She bought something expensive, Jack. A bracelet. It wasn't cheap." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Lily hadn't mentioned buying jewelry, and I hadn't seen anything new on her. My stomach churned at the thought of who that bracelet might be for. "And Greg?" I asked, gripping the edge of the table. "What do you know about him?" "Not much yet, but I'm digging," Mike said. "He's clean on the surface, married, father of 2, works as a financial consultant. But I'll keep looking. Sometimes the clean ones have the dirtiest secrets." "Keep at it," I said, my voice cold. "I need to know everything." We ended the call, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The weight of Mike's words settled heavily on my shoulders. 6 months. Jewelry. Greg. It all felt surreal, like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. When Lily came home that evening, I couldn't bring myself to look at her. She was cheerful, talking about her day and a new project at work. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but inside I was seething. Every laugh, every smile felt like a mockery. Later, when she went to shower, I grabbed her phone from the counter. She'd left it unlocked, something she never did, and for a moment I hesitated. But the need for answers outweighed the guilt. I scrolled through her messages, my heart racing. Most of it was mundane, texts with coworkers, updates from friends. But then I found it, a thread with Greg, under a contact name I didn't recognize. The messages were coded, vague, but there was no mistaking the intimacy. Greg. Same time next weekend? The cabin is perfect. Lily. Of course. I'll bring the wine this time. Greg. And I'll bring dessert. Can't wait to see you. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was real, undeniable. And I was done pretending otherwise. By the time Lily emerged from the shower, I'd put her phone back exactly where I found it. My mind raced with possibilities as I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. Every word she spoke grated against my nerves, every glance felt calculated. Yet I forced myself to smile and nod, playing the role of the oblivious husband. But inside, a storm raged. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I needed a plan. That night, as Lily slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Confronting her without preparation would give her the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let that happen. No, I would be deliberate, precise. She had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. The next morning, I called Mike again. "I'm ready to confront her," I said, my voice firm. "But I need to be smart about this." "All right," Mike replied. "Let's think it through. What's your goal here? Divorce? Reconciliation? Just exposing the truth?" I hesitated. "I don't know yet. I need her to admit it. To see her face when she can't deny it anymore." Mike sighed. "Fair enough. Here's what I suggest. Catch her off guard. Don't give her time to spin a story. And don't do it alone. Have someone neutral there if you can, even if it's just me." "Why?" I asked. "Because emotions run high in these situations," he said. "And if you want to stay in control, you need a witness. Someone to back you up if things escalate." It made sense, even if the thought of involving someone else felt uncomfortable. "All right," I agreed. "How do I do it?" "Wait for the right moment," Mike advised. "When she's not expecting it. And Jack, have your evidence ready. If you go in blind, she'll try to gaslight you." I thanked him and hung up, the wheels in my mind turning. Lily had already planned her next trip to the cabin for the upcoming weekend. If Greg was meeting her there, it was the perfect opportunity to catch them in the act. But this time, I wouldn't follow her alone. That evening, I called in a favor from my younger brother, Tom. He'd always been the hot-headed one in the family, but I knew I could count on him. "Tom," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I need your help." "What's going on?" he asked, instantly alert. "It's Lily. She's been seeing someone else." The silence on the other end was deafening. "Are you serious?" he finally asked, his tone dark. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah. I've got proof. But I need someone there when I confront her." "You got it," he said without hesitation. "When and where?" "Next weekend. At the cabin." We agreed on a plan, and by the time I hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I wasn't going into this alone. Dread at what I might uncover when the moment came. Over the next few days, I acted as if nothing was amiss. I smiled, I laughed, I played the dutiful husband. But inside, I was counting down the hours until the weekend, until the truth would finally come to light. The weekend arrived faster than I anticipated, and with it came a knot of anxiety that settled deep in my stomach. Lily spent Friday evening preparing for her trip, humming as she packed her overnight bag. I stayed out of her way, pretending to be engrossed in a book, but my eyes followed her every move. She kissed me goodbye early Saturday morning, her tone as cheerful as ever. "I'll see you tomorrow night," she said with a smile. "Don't miss me too much." I forced a chuckle. "Have fun painting." As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my bag, double-checking its contents: a change of clothes, my phone, a portable charger, and a small digital camera Mike had lent me. Evidence, he had said. Solid, irrefutable evidence. I called Tom to confirm he was on his way, and within half an hour, he pulled into my driveway in his beat-up truck. Tom stepped out, his expression grim. He was dressed in dark jeans and a hoodie, his usual casual attire, but there was a tension in his posture I hadn't seen before. "You ready for this?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied. "Let's go." The drive to the cabin was quiet. Tom didn't press me for details, and I didn't volunteer any. The weight of what I was about to do pressed heavily on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The closer we got, the more my hands trembled on the steering wheel. We parked a good distance from the cabin, just out of sight, and made our way through the woods on foot. The underbrush crackled underfoot, the crisp autumn air biting at our faces. The plan was simple: wait until Greg arrived, then confront them together. As we approached the clearing, I caught sight of Lily's car parked in front of the cabin. The sight of it made my stomach churn, but I pushed the feeling down, focusing on the task at hand. "Over here," Tom whispered, pointing to a cluster of trees that provided a clear view of the cabin without exposing us. We crouched down, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give us away. We didn't have to wait long. About 20 minutes later, another car pulled up. Greg stepped out, dressed casually in a leather jacket and jeans, carrying a brown paper bag in one hand. He looked around briefly before heading toward the cabin door. I felt Tom's hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "That him?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Greg knocked once, and Lily opened the door almost immediately, her face lighting up when she saw him. She pulled him inside, and the door closed behind them. For a moment, I just stared at the cabin, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to burst in right then and there, to catch them in the act and unleash the fury that had been building inside me for weeks. But Mike's words echoed in my mind: don't act on raw emotion. Stay in control. "We wait," I told Tom, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, though I could see the tension in his jaw. "Whatever you need, man." We settled into our hiding spot, the minutes crawling by. Through the windows, we caught glimpses of movement: Lily setting the table, Greg pouring wine, but no sound reached us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I decided it was time. "Let's go," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Tom followed close behind as we approached the cabin. My hand shook as I reached for the door, but I forced myself to stay calm. With one deep breath, I turned the handle and stepped inside. The cabin door creaked as it swung open, and the scene inside was almost too perfect, too contrived, like something out of a movie. Lily and Greg sat at the small dining table, wine glasses in hand, a candle flickering between them. Her laughter rang out, soft and melodic, and it cut me to the bone. They froze as I stepped inside, Tom close on my heels. The look on Lily's face was a mix of shock and horror, while Greg's quickly turned to something resembling fear. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Jack," Lily stammered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stepped further into the room, letting the silence stretch out. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, suffocating. "Nice setup," I finally said, my tone colder than I'd intended. My eyes flicked to Greg. "I didn't realize we were renting the cabin out now." Greg opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He glanced at Lily, as if looking for guidance, but she seemed equally at a loss. "This isn't what it looks like," Lily blurted out, standing up so quickly that her chair nearly toppled over. "Really?" I said, my voice rising. "Because it looks like you've been sneaking around with him for months. It looks like you've been lying to me. It looks like every trip to this cabin has been a cover for whatever the hell this is." Lily's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "Jack, please." "No!" I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare cry. Don't you dare make yourself the victim in this." Greg took a step forward, raising his hands as if to defuse the situation. "Jack, listen, man." "Shut up," I barked, turning my glare on him. "You don't get to talk. You don't get to explain. You don't get to stand in my cabin, at my table, and act like any of this is okay." Tom, who had been silent until now, stepped closer, his presence like a protective shield. "You heard him," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Sit down." Greg hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his eyes darting between me and Tom. Lily was still standing, her hands trembling as she wiped at her tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said, her voice barely audible. I laughed bitterly. "And how exactly were you planning for it to happen, Lily? Were you waiting for the right moment to destroy our marriage?" Or were you just going to keep sneaking off with him until I finally caught on? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she sank back into her chair, her head in her hands. I pulled my phone from my pocket and placed it on the table. I have proof, I said, my tone icy. Video. Texts. I know everything. Greg paled visibly, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Look, Jack. I said, shut up. I roared, slamming my hand against the wood. The force of it made the candle flicker, the flame dancing wildly. You don't get to look anything. You don't get to explain. You don't get to spin some excuse about how this just happened, like you tripped and fell into my wife. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the candle. Lily was sobbing softly now, her shoulders shaking. Greg looked like he wanted to disappear. I trusted you, I said, my voice breaking. Both of you. And this is what I get. Tom stepped forward then, his presence steadying me. What's your move, Jack? He asked quietly. I took a deep breath, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. You're leaving, I said to Greg, my tone final. Right now. And you're never setting foot in my life again. Greg hesitated, his mouth opening as if to argue, but one look from Tom silenced him. He stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out without another word. The sound of his car starting echoed in the quiet. When the door closed behind him, I turned to Lily. We're not done, I said coldly. Not by a long shot. The cabin felt suffocating once Greg was gone, the tension in the air thicker than ever. Lily sat at the table, her head in her hands, her body trembling. I remained standing, my arms crossed, glaring at her. Tom leaned against the wall, his arms folded, watching silently in case things escalated. Start talking, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. No excuses. No lies. Just the truth. Lily lifted her head, her eyes swollen and red. Jack, she began, her voice trembling. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I barked out a bitter laugh. You mean you didn't plan on getting caught? Yeah, I figured that much. Try again. She winced at my tone but didn't argue. I don't even know how it started. Greg and he's been struggling in his marriage, and I was frustrated with ours. We started talking, confiding in each other, and then… Her voice trailed off, her face crumpling with shame. It just happened. I shook my head, the words cutting deeper than I'd expected. It didn't just happen. You chose this, Lily. Every lie, every trip, every touch, you chose all of it. She sobbed harder, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. I never stopped loving you, she whispered. I swear, Jack. I was just lost. I didn't know how to fix things between us. Fix things? I repeated, incredulous. You thought the way to fix things was to cheat on me? To betray me with someone I trusted? Do you even hear yourself? She didn't respond, just buried her face in her hands. My anger boiled over. Do you know what the worst part is, Lily? It's not even the cheating. It's the lies. The months of looking me in the eye and pretending everything was fine. You didn't just betray me, you destroyed the foundation of everything we built together. Tom shifted, his expression grim. Jack, he said quietly. You don't have to do this now. You've got what you need. Let's go. I hesitated, staring down at Lily. Part of me wanted to keep yelling, to make her feel every ounce of the pain she'd caused. But another part of me was exhausted, drained by the weight of it all. Tom was right. This wasn't the place. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to speak calmly. You'll hear from my lawyer, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Pack your things and be gone before I get home. Her head snapped up, panic flashing across her face. Jack, please don't do this. Let's talk. We can fix this. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Fix it? Lily, this isn't a fight we can patch up. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door. Tom followed, his hand briefly squeezing my shoulder as we headed to the car. The drive back was quiet. Tom didn't push me to talk, and I was grateful for it. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, heartbreak, disbelief. But one thought stood out above the rest: my life would never be the same. When we got back to my house, I stood in the driveway for a long time, staring at the place that had once felt like home. It didn't anymore. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Jack," Tom said, breaking the silence. "You're going to get through this. It'll hurt like hell, but you'll get through it." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. But as I walked into the house and closed the door behind me, I realized one thing: the weight of Lily's lies was gone. And for the first time in months, I could finally breathe.